Have you ever been judged before you even said a word? Not because of what you did, but simply because of how you looked? James stepped into the first-class cabin on a bright sunny morning. In one hand, he held a simple leather briefcase. With the other, he gently held his 5-year-old son's hand, who was gleefully clutching a toy airplane. Celeste, his wife, graceful in an ivory dress, nodded politely at the flight attendant standing near the aisle. There was nothing unusual about them. Just a family of 3 going on vacation. Just a scene you've likely seen hundreds of times at the airport. But to certain eyes around them, it wasn't just that. They didn't look like the type who usually flew first class. And from that moment, a series of events began. All because of the color of their skin. In today's video, you'll walk alongside the real story of the Anderson family. A flight that seemed ordinary, but became a catalyst for an industry-wide reform. We'll witness how invisible biases can strip humanity from an entire system. You'll understand why real power doesn't come from anger but from how one chooses to respond to injustice. And finally, you'll realize sometimes, one small action can become the voice of millions who cannot speak up. Let us begin from that very moment, where a single mistaken glance sparked a wave of change deeper than anyone could have imagined. James Anderson was never one to seek attention. He dressed simply fitted navy suit, polished brown shoes. Celeste elegant, gentle. And Liam, their 5-year-old son, ran around chirping with his toy airplane, just like any child about to embark on a new journey. The family walked into the first-class cabin naturally, as they had done dozens of times before. They weren't pushy. Not loud. Not showy. Then, the glances. A few passengers paused their reading. A female flight attendant frowned briefly, then quickly replaced it with her practiced smile. No one said anything. But they didn't have to. Judgment doesn't always need words. Because sometimes, we don't judge with reason, but with deeply embedded mental templates. It's called impression bias. A prejudice formed from the very first look. It's not always malicious, but it can hurt just the same. According to a 2023 Harvard study, when a well-dressed white passenger and a well-dressed passenger of color stood side by side, airport staff were twice as likely to double-check the ticket of the person of color. Not because of a system error, but because of a mindset error. Never trust the first impression too quickly. It may make us overlook the kindest, most respectable people, simply because we've never seen someone like them in those positions. Because the first look never tells the whole story. James said nothing. He simply handed over his ticket, his gaze calm, unshaken. But Celeste, always perceptive, noticed something was wrong. And from that moment on, invisible cracks began to spread. Like a hairline fracture running down the body of what seemed like a perfect airplane. But what was more disappointing than the initial glances was how one staff member chose to turn that suspicion into action. In the name of procedure, James remained silent. But Celeste, having been a mother long enough to sense shifts in the air, knew something wasn't right. And then, what they called protocol began to show its true face. Veronica, the lead flight attendant, stepped into the first-class cabin with firm strides. She didn't yell. She didn't create a scene. She simply said, gently, "I need to check your tickets once more." James nodded, politely handed them over. Celeste frowned slightly, but stayed silent. Liam was too busy playing with his airplane to notice the adult stares. Ticket checks at first glance seem harmless. They're called protocol. But within that protocol, a bias was quietly legitimized. Because when a process is carried out unequally, it stops being a process and becomes intentional discrimination. Veronica didn't check the tickets of the other passengers. Only this family. Not due to technical error, but because she was suspicious. And the suspicion wasn't about the tickets. It was about their appearance. This wasn't rare. In 2017, an Asian passenger was dragged from his seat on a United Airlines flight for being overbooked. Later, it was revealed that the people given priority weren't even checked or forced off the plane. Or in 2020, a black woman shared on social media that she was asked to leave her first-class seat because she didn't look like she belonged there despite having a fully valid ticket. The problem doesn't lie in the rules. It lies in how the rules are interpreted. A phrase like "we're just following procedure" may sound harmless. But when it's only applied to a certain group of people, it becomes a mask for prejudice. Authority, when not accompanied by fairness, can easily become a tool to conceal personal bias. Sometimes, it's not the system that's broken. It's the people executing the system who lack integrity. Kindness in any service industry doesn't begin and end with a friendly greeting. It's in how we behave when given the power to make decisions. At that moment, James didn't lash out. He simply nodded and followed Veronica into a private area. But his eyes, and Celeste's eyes following him, spoke volumes more than words ever could. A minor procedure had just left a child confused, and made a family realize they weren't just passengers that day. They had become suspects because of the way they looked. But what truly unsettled the entire first-class cabin wasn't just the flight attendant's behavior. It was the calm, almost unnerving composure of the man being questioned. The man Veronica didn't realize was someone far more significant than she imagined. He stood there, neither stepping back nor forward, and asked gently, "What's the reason?" That simple question caused the entire cabin to pause for a moment. And within that silence, dignity began to speak. Veronica let James behind the curtain. No one knew exactly what was going on back there, but every eye in the first-class cabin began to follow the unfolding scene. Celeste stayed seated with Liam, trying to keep him calm. But her grip on his hand tightened. That woman knew. Her husband was now in a position where he had to prove that he deserved to be treated with respect. In that situation, many would have chosen to explode, to scream, to react furiously. But James did not. He wasn't angry. He didn't resist. He simply stood firm and asked, "Am I being asked to leave based on any specific reason?" Because he refused to let anger lead him. He let integrity do that. In a world where fast, loud, dramatic reactions are often seen as the way to demand justice, choosing silence, calmness, and asking for clarity might just be the most powerful voice of all. There's something few people realize. When you get angry, people look at your emotions. But when you stay calm, they're forced to look at their actions. In 2022, at a high-end restaurant in New York, a black businessman was denied service for not following the dress code. Instead of arguing, he simply pulled out his phone and showed video footage of the same restaurant serving a group of white customers dressed in t-shirts and shorts. He didn't need to raise his voice. He only needed to let the truth speak. And the next day, the restaurant issued a public apology and changed their policy. Silence does not mean weakness. Calm does not mean surrender. Sometimes, composure at the right time, in the right place, is the strongest way to protect your dignity. In that first-class cabin, a few passengers began to whisper. But they clearly had valid tickets. They didn't do anything wrong. A silent wave of discomfort started to ripple. Not because James caused a scene, but because even without doing anything, people felt the injustice. And from that very moment, things began to shift. Just minutes later, a phone call was made. Not to complain, but to act. Sometimes, unusual things don't need to be explained. They spread through glances, through silence, through quiet, sideways whispers. On that flight, when James was asked to step away from his seat. None of the other passengers were given an explanation. But they saw it. And they felt that something wasn't right. A middle-aged man sitting 2 rows back turned to his wife and whispered, "That's strange. I didn't have my ticket checked." A woman in glasses near the window shook her head. "That little boy didn't do anything, but his mom seems really worried." Then a young man, dressed casually, leaned toward Celeste. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" Celeste just gave a faint smile. But in her eyes something had shifted. They were no longer alone. Because in many cases, injustice doesn't survive alone. It needs the silence of bystanders to keep existing. And conversely, justice doesn't only come from the harmed. It comes from those who recognize the wrong and dare to speak it. In 2021, at a California subway station, a black man was stopped from buying a ticket for being a suspected fare evader. Other passengers filmed it. They questioned the staff. They demanded proof. The video went viral, over 10 million views in just 3 days. And forced the city's transit system to change their enforcement policies. Sometimes, you don't need to do anything grand. Just don't turn away. Just ask a simple question. Is something not right here? And that alone can make an entire system stop and look at itself. Inside that airplane cabin, those small whispers began to build immense pressure. Not yelling. Not protests. Just glances of solidarity. Questions gentle, but unmistakably clear. And at that very moment, the corridors of power within the airline began to tremble. Because only a few minutes later, James received a phone call. Not an apology, but a trigger for something much bigger than what people assumed about him. His phone vibrated quietly inside his suit pocket. James stepped out from the private area. His face calm as ever, and softly spoke into the receiver. "Yes. Proceed as planned." A simple sentence. But to those who understood, it was the signal of an oncoming quake. Within minutes, the airline's media division received an emergency call. Directly from their executive operations office. Contact name, James Anderson. Internal title, primary shareholder, a key investor and strategic overseer of the company. Not a VIP customer. Not a celebrity. But someone the airline was operating on behalf of. The twist began, with silence. And now that very silence was leading a wave of irreversible change. Why was this moment so shocking? Because it flipped the power dynamic entirely. The man who was scrutinized was now the man deciding who was fit to remain. Veronica, the one who once stood in command, was now the recipient of an internal warning from upper management. She stammered. I didn't know who he was." A colleague replied coldly. "That's the problem." And this story was not an isolated case. In 2019, the CEO of a major investment group walked into a bank branch, disguised as a regular customer. He was denied service because he didn't look like someone with a large account. 3 days later, that branch received orders to reassign its entire management team. Because real power doesn't need to flaunt. It only needs to be understood and used at the right time. Remember, the person you look down on today could be the one rewriting the rules tomorrow. Don't wait until someone has power to begin respecting them. Respect should be given from the start. Not after you discover who they are. James didn't have to raise his voice. He didn't have to threaten anyone. He only had to place one clear truth on the table. And within just 20 minutes, the balance of power on that flight had shifted toward the man who had once been dismissed, based solely on a glance. But James didn't stop there. Because someone like him understood. Power only matters when used for what's right. At the airline's headquarters, an emergency meeting was called that very night. Not about revenue. Not about partnerships. But about, a case of racial discrimination on Flight 237. On the big screen at the head of the boardroom, the name James Anderson appeared in bold letters, followed by a smaller line underneath. Primary shareholder, current legal action pending. The room grew heavy with silence. Because at that moment, every voice recording, internal log, and crew report made it clear. They had treated one of the most powerful figures in the company, unfairly. The HR director adjusted her glasses and spoke softly, yet firmly. We have passenger-recorded video. We have internal audio from the flight crew. And there's a post going viral with over 3 million views. The CEO sat still, then asked slowly. So, all the policies we once took pride in. Are we really enforcing them the way we claim to? No one answered. Because that was no longer a question about regulations. It was a question about responsibility and trust. Because many companies are excellent at writing policies, but lack the courage to live them. Especially when doing so confronts unconscious bias. When policies become personal. When the hurt person is no longer just a name, but someone sitting on your board of directors. The organization can no longer retreat. In 2018, Starbucks shut down more than 8,000 stores across the US for one day. To have all employees undergo racial bias training. The reason? 2 black men had the police called on them, while simply waiting for a friend without ordering a drink. Within days, the entire executive team turned a small incident into a sweeping reform. Not because of media pressure, but because they knew that doing nothing would mean forfeiting public trust. Policy without responsibility is just words printed on paper. And justice, if it doesn't reach daily action, will forever remain a slogan in speeches. That day, James didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand a personal apology. He calmly laid out 3 things. 1. Comprehensive training for all frontline employees on bias awareness. 2. A fair complaint system, where those facing discrimination could speak up. 3. Regular, transparent progress reports on how these changes would be implemented. And finally, he ended with a sentence that left the room in utter silence. I'm not asking for special treatment for myself. I just want to ensure no one else has to go through what my wife and son did today. Because the true cost of a policy isn't measured by the polished words in a boardroom, but by what happens out there, where a flight attendant, a passenger, and a child cross paths on what was supposed to be just another flight. When the plane finally landed, all the passengers disembarked in silence. James and his family were the last to step off quietly, without a scene. And Veronica was asked to remain on board. She sat alone in the now empty cabin. Her uniform hat resting quietly on her lap. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked her phone. And read the brief email again and again. Temporarily suspended pending internal investigation. Just hours before, she had been the face of the airline. Now, she was just a person, facing the consequences of her own choices. We often only see the victims of discrimination. Rarely do we talk about the ones who caused it. And what happens to them after. Veronica wasn't a bad person. She was just one cog in the machine. But she was a cog that chose silence over scrutiny. And acted upon bias. And because of that, she couldn't escape the consequences. Because in every story about justice, change doesn't truly begin if all we do is punish. Without also reflecting. Veronica lost her job. But what was more frightening was losing faith in herself. Sitting alone within 4 walls, she asked herself, what if I had just paused to ask one more question? What if I hadn't jumped to conclusions based on appearance? In 2020, a teacher in Florida was suspended after telling an Asian student to go back to China. when the student asked about COVID-19. Later, the teacher appeared at a community forum, publicly sharing how she had to learn again from her own mistake. The story didn't end in cancellation, but in a journey of internal repair. Some mistakes. An apology isn't enough. But if it's followed by genuine awareness of the harm done, and the effort to truly learn, that mistake can become the beginning of growth. In the days that followed, Veronica quietly stepped away from the media. No justifications. No blame shifting. Just one quiet email sent out. I take full responsibility. And I will learn so this never happens again. Not everyone gets a second chance. But everyone deserves the opportunity to learn again, if they truly wish to change. Because this story from start to finish was never just about a flight, a seat, or an apology. It was about the system within us. And when one person begins to look inward, society begins to shift along. Just hours after Flight 237 landed, the story of the Anderson family was being shared across social media. Not because they were famous. Not because it was scandalous. But because their silence spoke louder than any speech ever could. Thousands began sharing their own experiences. An Asian passenger recounted being stopped for extra baggage checks, just because they carried a food container. A single black mother shared how a flight attendant ignored her when she asked for water for her toddler. A disabled traveler wrote about being met with pity, more than with real support. The story of one family had become a mirror for thousands to see themselves more clearly. Because society often only responds when someone dares to speak on behalf of many. James, Celeste, and Liam were not official representatives of anyone. They were just an ordinary family, faced with an extraordinary situation, who chose an extraordinary response. And that is what made the world listen. In 2015, a Muslim teenager in Texas was arrested for bringing a homemade clock to class. A teacher thought it might be a bomb. The story went viral. And within 48 hours, students, engineers, and teachers across the world started sharing pictures of things they'd once been suspected for, just because of their name, appearance, or background. A single incident became the tipping point for countless silent pains. Never underestimate the power of a truthful story. When one person dares to tell it, thousands begin to heal. And when one person is truly heard, an entire system has to change. Celeste later said in an interview, I don't think we did anything grand. We just stayed calm because our son was watching. But as it turns out, the whole world was watching. Through Liam's eyes. With childlike clarity, no complex reasoning. Just a pure sense of right and wrong. And when thousands began to speak up, the airline realized they had no other choice but to act. Not to protect their reputation, but to restore trust. 1 week after that pivotal flight, the airline's homepage published an official statement. We sincerely apologize to Mr. James Anderson and his family for the inappropriate experience on Flight 237. We do not condone any form of discrimination, and we are committed to making a change. The wording was carefully chosen. The tone was formal. The photos were polished. But James didn't respond immediately. Because he knew a public apology without concrete action was just a polite way to cool down the public. And what happened next was the true turning point. 3 days later, the CEO held a live press conference. Not just to repeat the apology, but to announce a comprehensive reform plan, to begin that same month. Retraining all frontline staff. With mandatory completion of a course titled Unconscious Bias in Customer Service. Establishing a transparent feedback system. where passengers can report concerns, and employees can file complaints internally, without fear of retaliation. Appointing an independent third party to regularly audit progress, and publicly publish data on the airline's official website. Because an apology may mend the surface, but system reform is what heals the root. And when a company dares to admit its mistake through action, it doesn't just protect its image, it wins back trust. In 2022, a major food delivery platform in the US was accused of offering unequal bonuses. White drivers were favored over drivers of color, based on a biased algorithm. After the backlash, they didn't just apologize. They opened their entire internal data system for independent auditing, changed how performance was scored, and invited community representatives onto their advisory board. The result? Sales recovered. But more importantly, respect was reclaimed. Apologies matter. But if you truly recognize your fault, you correct it with action, not words. Because people don't remember what you said. They remember what you did after you listened. James wasn't looking for bout heads. He was looking for a roadmap. And this time he saw one starting to form. Not just for his own redemption, but so that every passenger who boards a plane after him can carry hope. That they'll be treated as a human being, not a profile. Because in the end, true change doesn't live in written policies. It lives in the small, repeated actions each day, until they become part of a new culture. 1 month after the incident, James, Celeste, and Liam boarded another flight. Same airline. Same cabin. But this time something was different. No suspicious glances. No awkward delays at the counter. A young flight attendant offered a genuine smile, and bowed slightly as she saw Liam holding his toy plane. "Welcome back, sir. Welcome back, family." That wasn't just a flight. It was a milestone. Where something, finally, had been healed. Not because all prejudice had vanished, but because one family chose to stand still when they could have walked away. Because many of society's greatest changes don't begin in Parliament. Don't begin on stage. They begin in a tiny moment. A glance. A quiet decision not to bow. A child watching his father hold onto dignity, instead of anger. Do you remember Liam? That 5-year-old boy with the toy airplane? On the new flight. He pressed his face against the window again, smiling quietly as he whispered, "Mom, everyone seems so kind today." Celeste squeezed his hand and nodded. She didn't need to say anything else. Because sometimes, the good we saw is not something we see immediately, but something others get to inherit. In 1990, a black woman was denied a job because she was deemed not a cultural fit for the company. She didn't sue. She began writing. She started teaching about unconscious bias in hiring practices. 3 decades later, her philosophy became the foundation of mandatory training in hundreds of major corporations worldwide. Her impact didn't come from who she was, but from what she chose to leave behind. When you're faced with injustice, you have 2 options. You can stay silent, walk away, and forget. Or you can pause gently, but firmly, so that those who come after you won't have to endure the same. That is how you leave a legacy. Not with money, but with character. James never wanted to be a hero. He just wanted to do the right thing. And when he did, an airline changed. A system woke up. And thousands of passengers gained one more reason to believe. Up in the sky, there's still room for justice. Thank you for staying with us through this story. If this story touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it so someone else might find hope. That dignity can still exist. In every class, every seat, and every corner of society. Have you ever faced a situation like this? Share your story in the comments below. Because who knows? Your story might just open a door for someone else.